What we think is happening is that Russia is developing a nuclear weapon for space that would be co-orbital, so it would be placed in orbit to be detonated later.
This is a conversation with Juliana Suess, the research fellow on space security at the Royal United Services Institute. And in this episode, we talk about war in space. We discuss why is space increasingly becoming the most important warfighting domain, the new space race between China and the US, how is space warfare playing out in the Ukraine war, why is Russia putting nukes in space, and much more. The corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And if you enjoyed this podcast and you want to support its continued existence, do consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. You help me make this happen, and you get bonus content, ability to ask questions to my guests, and full ad-free episodes in return. And now, enjoy the conversation. Alright, so welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I think that if we're going to be talking about space security and space warfare, probably a good way to start the discussion would be at the start, because to me it seems like it's a fairly new issue. The US Space Force, for example, was only established 5 years ago as a separate branch. So since when can we say that space became a factor in war and defense and national security, and how did it evolve since then?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're correct. I think that the current sort of public perception is that we have is that space is new, when actually that completely ignores the sort of long history that we have of space and defense. So even if we take it all the way back, right, to 1957, the launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite put into space by humans, that was also a show of military power, right? And the sort of space race that we saw between what was then the Soviet Union and the US, sort of unfolding sort of the years thereafter, a lot of that was also military power, showing off how far your missiles can go, how far your rockets can go. Because at the end of the day, if you can launch something into space, that also means you have the means to sort of send missiles towards your adversaries. So I think we do forget about that part quite often. Melissa Hannum, I think, put it quite well when she said it's not a space race, it was a missile race. So that's a good reminder as well. And I mean, when we talk about the militarization of space and how space is useful for defense and militaries now, again, you know, we saw that right from the start. Obviously, Earth observation satellites, you know, one of the first users for satellite in the Cold War, and also helped the US identify that actually, you know, the Soviet Union didn't have as many missiles as had been feared. So we saw this continuously evolve. And then I think that what we call the first space war was actually 1991. And that was because navigation, and specifically GPS, played a much larger role in the first Gulf War. That's the first time that we really see space sort of used in a conflict, if that makes sense. And I think, again, space has sort of been there in conflicts throughout, but I think it was specifically the war in Ukraine that really brought the headlines back onto space. And I think we quite often forget that, you know, navigation, as I mentioned, but also communication and intelligence gathering, a lot of that is informed and enabled through space already.
So maybe if we move to today and take a look at what role does space actually play in war and defense, I think NATO recently announced that space is the new warfighting domain. I think the fifth one. But what does that actually mean? What does it mean that space is a new warfighting domain? And what does defense and war in space today actually look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the official wording that NATO used was operational domain. So adding space to the operational domains. I think warfighting as a term, warfighting domain is less used than it was perhaps when the Space Force was first set up. At the end of the day, I think to an extent, there's also a debate about semantics and linguistics, right? But yeah, I mean, we see space being used in everyday operations all the time. And I mean, for example, the UK space power doctrine already says, the vast majority of operations could not be sustained without space. Number one, as I already mentioned, navigation through GPS, but also other systems, communications, especially when we're talking about beyond line of sight communications, so ships, planes, etc. And then the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance that we gain from space. So not just optical remote sensing capabilities in the sense of getting satellite images, but also radio frequency spectrum and radar spectrum images as well. And then also, of course, early warning satellites as well, warning us of ICBM launches, etc. Now, obviously, the utility of space that we get, that is enabled through space also paints space and the targets within it, the assets within it, a target as well. So that's where we see the sort of proliferation of counter-space weapons. And again, that is not something that's new, really. So I just talked about Sputnik in 1957. The first counter-space weapon was tested in 1959, so less than 2 years after the launch of Sputnik, just to give us an idea of how soon people had the idea that, a satellite can be useful. Therefore, perhaps we should also look into how they can be disrupted or disabled.
So what does that actually look like? Because that's basically what you're talking about, is that a lot of the assets that nations have in space are enablers for what is happening down on Earth. So the logical assumption that you're talking about is that you want to take out those assets and you want to deny your opponent this ability. And he probably wants to do the same thing to you. So what does that actually look like?
So there's a whole spectrum of capabilities that can be used to disrupt or deny satellite services. We're going all the way from the sort of temporary, non-kinetic spectrum all the way to the, permanent damage and sort of non-reversible measures. So, if we're talking about reversible measures, there's, jamming and spoofing of signals, for example, as well as cyber attacks. And then on the sort of other end of the spectrum, we have either kinetic intercepts of satellites, either through a missile launched from Earth or through another satellite in orbit. But then also, for example, directed energy weapons such as nuclear explosions in space that would not only, of course, with the blast wave, not only would the explosion obviously harm satellites in the immediate surroundings, but also the electromagnetic pulse would affect the electronics on satellites, much further out than that. And it would also leave behind an environment of radiation that would mean that all satellites in that area would be degraded much more quickly. Again, most of these things we've either seen happen already or they've been tested. So I think it's quite important here to emphasize that when we're talking about kinetic intercepts of satellites, those have never been used against another state's satellite. They've only ever been tested against states' own assets. So if we're talking about direct ascent anti-satellite weapons, for example, they've been tested by Russia, China, the US, and India. But again, none of them have ever been used against another state's satellite. Whereas jamming and spoofing, for example, but also cyber attacks against satellites, those we've seen plenty of in the last couple of years. We've definitely also seen them during the war in Ukraine.
So maybe let's stay with the kinetic ones, because they seem to me sort of probably as maybe the easiest option that you have, because unlike a lot of the assets that you have on Earth, the satellites that are in space seem to be extremely vulnerable because they can't really move anywhere. They can't shoot down anything that might be shot at them. So if you would have a conflict between two nations that have this kind of capability, what would prevent both sides from immediately when the conflict starts, just shoot down all of the satellites of your opponent and basically take each other's capabilities out in the first hours of any conflict?
Sure. I mean, there's a couple of factors at play here. I think number one, in the times that we live now, the sheer volume of satellites that exists, it would simply be a very inefficient method of trying to disrupt satellite services. If we're looking at the proliferated constellations that exist, Starlink is a phenomenal example here. Perhaps also almost a too big example, right? It's more than 6,000 satellites at this point in time when we're speaking, Dominic. So if you really wanted to completely disrupt all Starlink services, that would be a lot of missiles you'd have to expend to actually make a difference. And by that time, not only would you have created a lot of space debris that's also dangerous to you and your assets, it would, from a sort of tactical point of view, it doesn't really make sense. And I think that brings me on to the space debris problem that we have in any case. Even without kinetic intercepts, space debris is a problem that we're having to deal with. Obviously, any kinetic intercept creates a bunch of debris that is difficult to control, really. So even an anti-satellite weapons test from 2007 was so destructive that actually it got in the way of the International Space Station all the way further on in 2021. So some of this debris can be really long-lasting, depending on obviously the angle, etc., the orbit that it's in. But essentially, kinetic intercepts are then also dangerous for the attacker as a result of the debris that is created. So that's what we call also the KSA syndrome. So that's when we talk about a debris creation that almost gets out of hand, where you have a sort of domino effect of debris creating more debris. And ultimately, the big worry is that an orbit simply becomes unusable.
If this kind of conflict would happen, on one hand, you would have the nations would have the option of using the kinetic force, but then you would have the risk of resulting in a Kessler syndrome. And in that kind of a dilemma, what do you think would happen? What do you think would the thinking be?
I think in the first instance, and this is exactly sort of what we've seen in Ukraine as well. I think in the first instance, it's more about degrading satellite services. So that's what we saw with the cyber attack against the internet provider Viasat. Then we saw, sustained jamming of GPS signals all across Ukraine. Again, not something entirely new. We've seen that happen in eastern Ukraine since 2014, actually. Because at the end of the day, you have to expend much less energy and capability to be able to do that. The Russian forces specifically have very, sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities that they can use. They don't need to sort of use a missile to actually make an impact. So I think if you're really looking at it from a really neutral perspective of a cost-benefit analysis, you expend much less capabilities and effort if you use the reversible measures, which we have seen the jamming be really sustained in Ukraine, and therefore it has really impacted the availability of GPS signals. So the goal was sort of achieved without actually without having to do a kinetic intercept. And again, if you wanted to shoot down GPS satellites sit in medium Earth orbit, which is also higher than, for example, what the Russians have tested in terms of the kinetic intercepts. That was always in lower Earth orbit. So I think kinetic intercepts, I think at least at the stage where we are now, because obviously when they were first tested back in the 50s, the states didn't have many satellites. Whereas now we are talking about, hundreds, if not thousands of satellites in the constellation, where, servers wouldn't necessarily be all that disrupted if you took out one of those satellites. So really, I think that the kinetic intercepts, whether it's co-orbital or whether it's, direct descent anti-satellite weapons, their utility is almost, purely constrained to unique assets that we see, where it's, for example, let's think of sort of military satellites, smaller constellations that sit in geostationary orbit, for example, where there's only 2 or 3 satellites in a constellation, where, if you actually did take one of those out, that would also obviously have much more of an impact. I think that's kind of where we see the utility of kinetic intercepts right now. But again, it doesn't get around the consequence that you have of creating debris that is then also dangerous to yourself. So, obviously, states are still developing direct descent anti-satellite weapons, kinetic intercepts that are used sort of in orbit as well. So I don't think it's completely gone as a capability that is being developed, but I think it's its use case scenario is much more constrained in the modern day.
So would you say we're moving away from that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's what we've seen in terms of developments as well. Because obviously, the more states develop their own space capabilities, the less they want to have to deal with debris as well. So we've definitely seen the trend go more towards, non-kinetic capabilities. Again, what we've seen with, especially what we can see in the electromagnetic spectrum, for example. And so that the trend is definitely moving away from there.
Can you maybe describe the Kessler syndrome in a little bit more detail to people who are not aware of what it is and what could its consequences be? Because we've mentioned it, but we haven't really explained what it actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kessler syndrome is a sort of scenario that was thought of by someone working at NASA back in the 70s, I think. And it was basically the worry about debris in orbit. So obviously, when we say debris in orbit, that can be anything from like, a little bit of paint that's chipped off a satellite, or it can be a whole defunct satellite that's no longer maneuverable because it's run out of fuel, or because of some other complications, it can no longer communicate with its ground station. So, we talk about space debris. It can be all, it can be a teeny tiny piece of plastic all the way to a huge satellite that's non-maneuverable. So, I think given the speeds at which things travel in orbit, these things can get really, really dangerous. So, for example, in low Earth orbit, a piece of debris as big as 1 centimeter can have the impact of a hand grenade. So, we really shouldn't underestimate even little bits of debris. And again, something doesn't have to be shaped like a bullet or, meant to be as a weapon to actually do great damage in space. And we obviously, we see these things happen all the time. The ISS has been hit by small pieces of debris a couple of times. We obviously track the bigger pieces of debris, to make sure that they don't bump into something, that could, sort of impact on satellite services. But anything under 10 centimeters gets really difficult to track. So, with solar panels being chipped, etc.
I would now maybe like to talk about a few of the individual capabilities of the nations that are at the top when it comes to space power or space capabilities. And I think probably it would make sense to start with the US, because my assumption would be that, as in other defense areas, the United States is most likely leading the space race today. So is that a correct assumption? And if it is so, how far ahead is the US ahead of all the other space powers?
So you are correct. The US is the predominant space power. It is still quite far ahead also in terms of, if we're looking at sort of budget dedicated to space, whether it's defense space or otherwise, the US is most certainly far, far ahead of most other sort of countries that we see. I think that doesn't mean we should sort of discard what other states are doing in space. Specifically, China has really caught up. So all the efforts that we're seeing China now expend in space, we can sort of date that back to the 1990s. They've really sort of set out a space program, space ambitions, and it's really grown from strength to strength. So not only has China sort of hit all the milestones it said it was going to hit, it's sort of continuing to make great strides there. I think an interesting case to look at is also Russia, right? As this sort of original first space power, the first to launch a satellite, the first to put a person into space. Russia has really fallen behind. And a lot of that is due to the corruption that we're seeing. A lot of that is due to sanctions that have obviously been in place since 2014, but specifically since 2022, sanctions have also been quite specifically targeted towards the aerospace sector. We see a huge amount of brain drain when it comes to the aerospace sector in Russia. A lot of people either go abroad or they don't want to go into the aerospace sector at all. And then simply aging infrastructures. So a lot of the constellations that we see Russia putting in orbit, a lot of them are either old or cannot be replaced sort of by their new generations because timelines are delayed, because of materials not being there, and corruption as well, as I mentioned earlier. So Russia's really falling behind as a space power, whereas we really see China rise as a space power. So if we're sort of wanting to put them on a podium, the US is still far ahead, but China is in second place, also with the ambition of being a comprehensive space power by 2045, and then Russia, I would almost put into third place now.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. Can we maybe estimate how far China is ahead behind the US? And maybe what are some of the capabilities in which the US is leading the race?
I mean, I don't think we should forget how long sort of the US has been working on this. So there's a lot of things that we look at in space where obviously the US can rely also on its extensive network of allies as well. So for example, a case that I quite often like to use is space situational awareness. It's what we call SSA. So the ability to be able to see what is in space, not only tracking your own assets, but also tracking adversaries' assets. Now, in order to be able to do that, you obviously need an extensive network of radar stations all around the world, because if you only put them in, a particular region, you only get a snapshot of space. You don't get a sort of whole comprehensive picture. The US has the biggest sort of network of these, has the most comprehensive SSA catalog, as we call it. So all of the data is coming from the US. Russia actually has a pretty comprehensive SSA network too, and that's because a lot of its sort of radar stations left over from the Cold War, right? A lot of the early warning sites. So Russia's sort of second in that regard. And then China obviously almost has the, I'm going to say, problem in the sense of perhaps not as many allies as the US. Where do you put these radar stations? So they've made a lot of sort of space partnerships that they've forged with other countries, then building radar stations around the world. Quite a lot of them have since actually terminated their contracts because it wasn't quite sure. There were sort of some doubts being expressed about what's happening in those radar stations, what purpose they were used for, etc. So, for example, Chile and Australia have terminated their contracts with China over those radar stations. So what China actually uses to track certain rocket launches is they send out ships. So sort of as soon as the ships will go first, obviously, to assume their position in the sea. And then as a rocket gets launched, it then enables them to sort of track that rocket all throughout its flight, and not just sort of, suddenly the radar signature drops off because it's too far away from the corresponding radar station. So I think that gives us an idea of the sort of difficulties of space. It's not just about how much money you have or how many, brilliant people you have working on the program. A lot of it also has to do with geography, sort of ironically enough, if we're talking about space. So there's a bunch of things that we need to look at. So in terms of the technology that the US has been able to develop, obviously over many, many years, they're certainly ahead also because obviously in terms of military capabilities, again, stuff tested in the Cold War. There's a whole bunch of sort of capabilities also in the counter space realm where even if the US doesn't have a dedicated program looking into this, they could probably build it relatively quickly and sort of, use its Cold War experience as well. So I think that's what we're sort of seeing. But it's interesting you mentioned the sort of China-US dimension here. And I think we do talk about that sort of space competition, perhaps. And I think one of the ways in which we can see that really well is actually space planes. So when we talk about space planes, we talk about maneuverable space assets. They look a little bit like the Apollo shuttle, but they're basically experimental space assets. We don't really know what exactly they're meant to be doing. So the US space plane project has been running for quite some time. It's called X-37B. Only recently were pictures actually released of X-37B. Before then, everything was always kept very secret, which obviously led to a whole bunch of conspiracy theories about what's on board X-37B, even though it's much too small to actually be a weapons platform, for example. Based on its behaviors in orbit, it's much more likely that it has some sort of experimental remote sensing capabilities. So there's X-37B, and then at some point, China started launching Shenlong, which is also a space plane. And again, we haven't seen any pictures of it. We know that it, similarly to X-37B, it remains in orbit for quite some time. They're not quite as long, so just under a year about there. But I think, the space planes that we've seen are perhaps one of the programs that we can see that competition sort of most obviously.
And I guess since you can't really separate, or you can, but probably not completely, the civilian and the military capabilities, I guess one of the advantages of the US is that it also has the civilian program. I mean, NASA is a civilian organization, not a military one, but I would assume that whatever NASA is doing is helping out US space power in general as well a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in space, we always talk about the dual use dilemma, in the sense that things can be used for civilian, but also for military purposes, right? So, one person's satellite image to help see how crops are growing is someone else's intelligence. So that's just one example. So, I mean, obviously, having the great minds who work at NASA sort of, at hand, so to speak, certainly gives the US an edge. And that's also something that sort of feeds into the whole legacy program that I mentioned that the US has, the experience it can fall back on for sure.
And talking about the Russian military capability, I think we have to mention, or we have to talk about it for at least a little bit, what role has space so far played in the war in Ukraine? And maybe what does that tell us about Russia's space capability?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting. I actually sat down and sort of did a comparison of how Ukraine has used space and how Russia has used space. And actually, Ukraine is not your stereotypical space power, right? But it's actually Ukraine that has used space at the more tactical level than Russia, which I thought was quite interesting. So a lot of that has to do with the sort of hierarchy within the Russian military, but it's also got to do with the aging technology that I mentioned earlier. So, if we're going through the sort of military capabilities that there are, like navigation, communication, ISR, and if we compare and contrast, for example, obviously, Russia has its own navigation constellation. It's called GLONASS. It's sort of the Russian answer to GPS. We don't think that Russia can fully rely on GLONASS because we saw downed fighter jets that had a civilian GPS receiver sort of taped to the dashboard, which gives us a sort of anecdotal evidence that perhaps GLONASS is not operating to its fullest capacity. Also, quite a few of the weapon systems that Russia is using do not rely on GLONASS. So, for example, if we're looking at the Shaheds, obviously Iranian drones by origin, but a lot of them, they do rely on GPS as well as an inertial navigation system, for example. So that's just sort of for navigation. I think another telling one here is if we're looking at the insides of Russian tanks, there's no blue force tracking happening at the tactical level. So, the screens that you have within a tank that show you where your allied forces are, where everyone else is, they don't exist in Russian tanks for the most part, as far as we can tell. So if you want to see where everyone else is, you sort of have to phone back to the command post and they can then tell you. It's not something you can do sort of as a from within the asset. And then communications, a little bit harder to tell, but we have seen Russian troops use mobile phones specifically towards the beginning of the conflict, which might be an indication that satellite communication services are not as widely available, or perhaps not, can't be used at a tactically relevant pace. If we're looking at the communication satellites that Russia has, there are some indications that, again, is quite aging infrastructure. They also have something called mailbox satellites. So that's basically a signal stored and then sent back down later when a ground station becomes available, which does mean that perhaps messages take longer to be relayed than you would, certainly hope if you want to speak tactically. And again, most of the time, those capabilities are not at the hands of the soldiers. Again, that's something that we typically see at the more senior level. And then satellite imagery, there was some sort of indications that Russia wasn't using satellite images to, the extent that we would expect Western forces, for example, to use them. For example, for battle damage assessment, they were mostly relying on sort of the pilots' evidence or sort of back brief thereafter. It also meant that they were more susceptible to deception campaigns by the Ukrainians. We do know, however, that Russia has been buying commercial satellite imagery since April 2022. And there has been evidence as well. There was a Chinese SAR company, so SAR being synthetic aperture radar, so that's radar imagery that can see through cloud cover. There was evidence of them handing over satellite images to the Wagner Group, and they were sanctioned thereafter. So I think we definitely see that Russia sees the utility in technologies such as satellite images, but perhaps cannot rely fully on their own capabilities to actually sort of use it. And then the Ukrainians, obviously, Starlink came in at the beginning of the war, which has been enabled the flying of drones, for example. Obviously, I don't think we need to spend too much time on this, but we've also seen the huge civilian use or utility that Starlink has brought to people. Being able to check in with each other, being able to communicate safety routes, being able to communicate, where water and food is available, etc., fuel. So huge utility there. And then also, the satellite images that were given to Ukraine, either through commercial providers, but also obviously working hand in hand with the US military there. So satellite images there were being used for target acquisition, but also, being able to even tell that the war was beginning, because we could see the military build-up along the border, but also being able to, in front of the international community, be able to find out what had happened in Bucha, for example, and being able to say, we know exactly when Russian troops passed through the town, and we know how the town developed in that time.
So you've mentioned that Ukraine is largely relying on Starlink, and I think Starlink now has like a special military branch for these types of purposes. But that kind of leads me to a question: to what extent does a country actually need its own capabilities up in the space, and to what extent can it just rely on commercial providers? Because I would sort of assume that maybe a lot of what traditionally used to be available only to governments is now available to basically anyone who's willing to pay for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually Starlink is a good example to talk about how a commercial company can be hugely useful, but also talking about what the potential dangers might be of relying on commercial companies alone. Because if you remember, a couple of months into the conflict, and this was before a contract was sort of signed between the US Department of Defense and Starlink, or SpaceX, the company that owns Starlink. And suddenly SpaceX turned around and said, we never intended for Starlink to be used for military purposes. And, saying that they were going to curb attempts of Starlink being used militarily, whether it was for command and control or whether it was being used for drones. That conversation has sort of died down since the contract was put in place. But I do think it's, especially in those instances, I think it's important to talk about, how commercial companies can sort of make those decisions. And obviously, Starlink was a unique case in the sense that there was no contract in place. It all happened very fast. It was it looked like Twitter diplomacy. It wasn't actually Twitter diplomacy, because Ukraine and SpaceX had been talking for quite some time before the conflict had started, not even with the war in mind, but simply to sort of connect the more rural parts of Ukraine. But that was a very unique scenario. But I do think if we're then talking about how do states sort of leverage and how do they manage, their space assets, and what needs to be owned and what can be sort of bought in through commercial. I do think it has sort of colored that conversation a little bit with that scenario in particular. And I mean, you always have to have those conversations in the sense of what needs to be owned in terms of what needs to be a sovereign capability that is operated by the military that the state has full control over, versus what is the capability that we need, but also, if we're talking about how expensive it is to field some of those capabilities and where can we work with commercial to make that happen. And I think one aspect where that sort of approach melts is resilience. And, we obviously talked about counter space capabilities at the beginning of our conversation. And I think disruption simply has to be factored in now. We have to assume that certain satellite services will at the very least be degraded, if not disrupted, in a conflict, whether that's GPS or whether it's communication services, whether it's the availability of satellite images. So being able to rely on different services because they're in a different orbit, because they use a different radio frequency, maybe because they present less of a target because they are a commercial company rather than a state asset, right? There's all these different factors here where it's a sort of trade-off of, how available are they likely to be in a conflict scenario. So having that those commercial capabilities on standby at the very least is a huge advantage. So that doesn't mean we need to buy everything from commercial. It also doesn't mean we need to own everything. I think it's a sort of mixed approach that is of most value here.
Just a quick break here. In the coming months, I will be starting a newsletter focused on what you need to know and what you might have missed in geopolitics. It's completely free and you can already sign up for it, and it would be quite helpful if you do that. You can find the link for the sign up in the description below. And now, back to the conversation. And then another area where the US is, I think, completely dependent on commercial sector is the capability to actually get the stuff into orbit, where I think NASA or the US government is now fully reliant on companies like SpaceX. And I guess that's also an advantage that it has those companies, and maybe it's cheaper, but I guess there might be some disadvantages that come with that as well.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, we talk about SpaceX as this sort of plucky startup sometimes still, which I think is interesting because if they hadn't been given a whole lot of money from the US government, they would likely not be here in the way that they are now. I mean, the SpaceX launch industry that they've built for themselves is what has made things such as Starlink even possible, right? If we didn't have at least weekly launches, there wouldn't be 6,000 Starlink satellites in orbit right now. So it has been a game changer in the launch industry. It has brought down the cost of launch massively. But also the alternative is complete reliance on Soyuz and the Russian rockets. Right. So up until 2019, when the Dragon capsule was developed by SpaceX, at that point, the US and, European astronauts as well, when they were when they went to the ISS, they were, they had to fly with Soyuz. And obviously seeing what happened 3 years later when, the space partnership was called into question because of the war, and obviously it is now continuing. But when that was called into question, if we hadn't had Dragon at that point, there would have been much more leverage that could have been used by the Russians to say, well, we're not bringing your people home, for example. And that is something that Russia did do, for example, not with people, but with assets, right? So we had OneWeb satellites at Baikonur, the spaceport that the Russians are using, and they were simply sort of impounded. And I haven't seen an update on this, but the last update I had was that the OneWeb satellite was still still at Baikonur, wasn't released. So, again, there's a lot of leverage there where, yes, commercial companies have stepped into that gap, but the alternative is a much more tricky situation.
Does China have these launch capabilities of its own, or does it have to rely on the Russians?
No, so China has a growing launch industry as well. They have several launch sites. That being said, they have set themselves really ambitious goals of how many satellites to launch, and they also have a growing commercial sector. So they have set, I think their goal for 2024 is to have 100 launches. They're currently short of that number, even now in October when we're recording this. So it looks like they'll be falling slightly short. So given the big ambitions that China has for its commercial program and the amount of commercial satellites they want to put into space, it looks like they'll be falling short. They have been trying to keep at pace with what the US is doing. So they're now also working on reusable rockets, or at least stages of rockets that can sort of come back down to Earth after they've launched. So we do see that kind of innovation development happening in China as well. They've also had a couple of missteps in that time. Again, that's not unique to China. The saying it's not rocket science. There's a reason why we say that, because it is really hard. So we have seen a couple of sort of misstarts and things not going well on the launch pad. We've also seen debris falling down just over the launch pads, endangering people's houses, etc. So the safety record isn't great at the moment. And we definitely see China being behind its sort of schedule it's set for itself in terms of getting enough commercial satellites into orbit. But yes, China also has ample launch capabilities and sites. It's just lagging a little bit behind.
I wanted to pick up on one more thing that you've mentioned a while ago, which was that the Russian military is having to rely on, in some instances, on GPS rather than just its own navigation system. And I was wondering if that doesn't actually leave them kind of vulnerable to someone taking advantage of that. Because if I'm correct, the GPS is still a system controlled by the US military, and that's allowed to be used by civilians worldwide, but it was developed and is still controlled by the US government.
So there's a civilian and there's a military sort of GPS signal. So the military one, for example, is obviously harder to jam. It's sort of got extra protections in place. But the civilian one can, as you said, can just be used by everybody. Then again, looking back onto the situation in Ukraine, we have seen, wide-reaching jamming of GPS taking place. And actually, the interesting thing is, as I mentioned earlier, the Russian weapons, or the weapon systems that the Russians are using, not necessarily Russian weapon systems, but a lot of them are reliant on GPS as well. So actually what we've seen is a pattern of GPS jamming will be lifted about 20 minutes before an air attack, because that's when the Russians themselves are relying on GPS.
Talking about space programs, I think it would be interesting to talk about Europe as well, because it would seem to me that probably most European nations, maybe even including France or the UK, probably can't afford to have space programs that would be comparable with China, Russia, definitely not the US. So we do have European Space Agency, but that seems to have primarily a civilian purpose of space exploration. So how does this work? Do Europeans just expect to always rely on the US, or is there a plan to create some shared defense space capability as well?
That's a great question. I mean, first of all, yes, there is still a huge reliance on the US for space coming from Europe, but I think the topic is definitely gaining momentum within Europe, and it's also definitely gaining momentum within the EU. And we're also seeing that the military significance of space is also gaining traction within the EU. So, for example, we saw the EU Space Strategy for Security and Defence come out in 2023. Space was declared a strategic domain in 2022 by the EU. And we're definitely seeing that conversation shift from a purely civilian sort of focus that we had previously with ESA. We do see the EU now also talking about defense space, which I think is an important conversation to have. For example, PESCO, we are now seeing that 4 out of 16 projects are space, that are, 4 of the 16 projects that are funded are space, for example. So we are definitely seeing that conversation changing. And I think don't sleep on the EU and its space capabilities, right? So, we always talk about how long everything takes in the EU and, bureaucracy slowing it down, etc. But, if we're looking at multilateral forums that have actually brought about satellite constellations, I only see the EU, if we're looking at Galileo, which is the EU's navigation service, if we're looking at Copernicus, which is the satellite imagery service, and obviously IRIS², which is meant to be a communication constellation, still in the planning stage. But, those are, real life constellations that are now orbiting, being used, that were planned and brought about by the EU. So, if we're looking, in turn at NATO, for example, which has said from the beginning they were not going to build their own satellite services, they were going to rely on alliance members to sort of volunteer their capabilities, which obviously is just how any other military capability in NATO is sort of divided up. But then I think, we need to look at what the EU is doing. And I think, again, as you quite rightly said, a country like France, UK, Germany cannot try to compete with the US on this. But as a community, as a European community, there's much more that can be done, whether in the civilian space with ESA or whether in the military space as well.
What is the situation for the UK then? Since the UK is not, it's part of the ESA, but it's not part of the EU, so it's probably not part of a lot of the developments that are happening there.
Yeah, that's right. So, for example, Galileo, the navigation service that the EU has built, the UK cannot be part of that because it's a security project, and as such, non-EU members are excluded. It does, however, negotiate itself a deal that means it still has access to Copernicus, so that's satellite images. So I think it's a sort of case-by-case basis in which the UK can get involved. I would argue this is definitely a sort of disadvantage for the UK, not being able to, buy in and be part of what the EU is doing. And I do think we sort of see the UK tilt more naturally towards the US when it comes to space, which again is not really unique because we also do see other European partners work quite closely with the US, and it makes sense, right? But certainly if we're talking about bigger projects, it simply makes sense to either do payload sharing, for example, to build satellite constellations together. France has been very good at doing this, actually. They share a Earth observation constellation with Germany, and they share a communication satellite constellation with Italy. So, we do see those partnerships happening. The UK has not been as proactive, perhaps.
One more thing that I wanted to talk about was this development or these news that broke out earlier this year when the Biden administration announced that Russia was developing something that seems like a nuclear space weapon. And I think it's still a bit unclear what is it actually supposed to be? But afterwards, there were remarks from US congressmen that we could see a Cuban Missile Crisis in space. So what did actually happen, and why do nations put nuclear weapons in space for, and what would this hypothetical Cuban crisis in space look like? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.